My name is Scott White. I work for Flint Hills Resources, and I'm part of the cross-site asset management capability that we have, and specifically for fixed equipment. And I provide admin and business level support to APM, and that's across our 2 refineries and the terminals part of our pipelines and terminals business. That's part of Flint Hills Resources. And so I was first exposed to Meridium APM back in 2007 when I actually worked for the company called Meridium at that time. And then in 2012, I joined Flint Hills Resources in the fixed equipment group. And here we are 14 years later. As they say, my, time flies. And so it's good to see you guys here today. And so I think you're supposed to check in, since this is on the slide deck here. I didn't add that, so you need to check in there with Flint Hills 26. And so this morning I want to spend a few minutes and just talk about our walk you through our transformation at Flint Hills Resources, from moving from a heavily customized version of Meridium at the time all the way up to now in GE Vernova Cloud. And this was a multi-year journey for us. This is not a one-time technical migration presentation here. It's just to briefly take you through a little bit of history, and then to take you where we are today and tell you where we want to look at going in the future here. So, if you look at what the primary objectives were for our move to the cloud, it was, we wanted to reduce our technical debt. We wanted to ensure some scalability, and we wanted to improve the user experience and everything that goes along with that, we wanted to, not lose any functionality, protect our critical inspection, corrosion monitoring, and risk-based functionality that we have in APM. And by the way, we are an integrity customer only. We don't have the other modules, but we're integrity. As I was saying, we had that was the main reasons for doing it. And the story that I have is we had a lot of challenges to get us here, but I feel like as any long-term Meridium long-term customer would see, and maybe coming off on-prem, some of the stuff that I showed today may resonate with some of you, and hopefully it does. And so we'll get into here the agenda. And so I want to just briefly, just a little bit of history, why we would transform, take you through the transformation process and how we modernized, and then I'll finish up with what our current experience with cloud and what's next, and then we'll take any questions. And feel free to stop if you see something or we need to go and you want to ask a question, then feel free to do that. And so that's the agenda for as we go through here. And so where did we start? We were one of the original framework customers back in version 1 and 2. To Mr. Paul's comment this morning about being version 2, well, we were actually a little before that. Flint Hills is actually at a version 1. So we didn't have modules at that point. It was just a foundation. And in 2009, we agreed and decided this is when we actually licensed the inspection thickness monitoring, and we had an API connector to the risk-based calculator. And these were all, and then in 2009, we started the implementation at that point to set out to build a centralized integrity solution. At the time, it was on an on-prem Oracle database. And we customized Meridium because we could. We were given the capability to do it with the tool set. And there were some things that we had in our workflows within integrity and the mechanical integrity groups where the functionality, there were a few things specifically and more in the corrosion monitoring, and a few things where the product in the early years just didn't have quite the functionality it has today. So we built in some things, again, because we could. And so we ended up at the largest point, we had about 115,000, as it says there, about 115,000 fixed equipment items and related equipment in V3 at the time. It was across 10 plus sites for Flint Hills Resources, which we have divested some of those sites now. But at the time, it was 10 plus sites. And really, that was our baseline for where we started unraveling the yarn. And so we then so now we start looking at, what is the transformation journey and why transform for us? What was the reason for it? Well, there was fueled a lot by a cloud-first shift in our IT group. So Flint Hills Resources IT was moving toward a cloud-first, across other applications, and we were pulled into that, for lack of a better term. And at the time, it wasn't bad for us. And I'm sure you've all seen the reasons. You've all heard these. You probably even said some of these. Standardization, customization, move those. Modernize, improve, all those things that people say when they want to move to another application. And it always gives you a reason to do it. And so where we ended up was the business and IT agreed. The business being the fixed equipment business and the IT group within Flint Hills Resources, we agreed. And so we started this more of an incremental change because, again, we had out of the box APM at the time, Meridium at the time. You really didn't. We still lacked some thickness monitoring capabilities, some functionality. We also still had the connector to an external RBI calculator. So this begins our strategy for unraveling the yarn. And then what do you do first? Well, we got to deal with the foundation. So we were one of the very few customers, maybe only one other, where we actually had Meridium Foundation as the actual registry for equipment and functional locations. And it was kind of the hub, and we had spokes and integrations that came off the Meridium database that it actually fed our CMMS. It actually fed other applications as well. So that process to unravel that was not just something you could just flip a switch and make it happen. So we started that process, and we working again with IT, and IT had at the same time in a parallel project there where they were switching CMMSs. So there was a project in the process within that group to switch the CMMS product. So at that time, there was a strong desire to do what everyone else had done, and that's pull functional locations and equipment back into the CMMS and let that be the driver, let that be the master system for that. So we agreed. It really didn't matter to us as long as we were getting what we needed in APM to be able to act upon it. So that took a lot of time. That took a lot of IT work to get this. And so the foundation took some time with the actual working with the IT group and changing. You can imagine you had to reverse all the integrations. You had to do it was change management because of the way things were done internally to enter data and where it was entered. So a lot of change management, day-to-day operations, and eventually we started this. At the same time, we were laying the groundwork for the V4 platform. So that takes us into what I'd call modernization. So we were moving off the old V3 Citrix. We had a Citrix-based. It was all centralized on physical hardware in Wichita, Kansas, the main office. And we delivered it to the users via Citrix. And we wanted to move into that modernization layer, get it to be more web-based. And so we did that with moving to the V4 platform. And this, again, continued with a centralized database in the Wichita office. It was, at the time, a SQL Server database. It was still on physical hardware at this time. And because of this, part of this rollout, this last item here, we had a significant training effort where we actually went and trained on-premise in each of the refineries, and at the time, the chemical plants that we had still in part of Flint Hills Resources, and trained them for the V3 to the V4 move because of the difference, quite a bit of difference in the application. And at the time, this is when we really began the application footprint reduced a bit. And some of that was based on some cleanup, some of it was based on some ideas of some scope focus, and we also had divested some sites. Flint Hills Resources the footprint of the actual site began to be smaller at that time. So we're removing the next layer of the yarn here. And so we then get to what I'd say cloud preparation. And so this is a lot. This is one slide. There's a lot of years and a lot of work to get us here. And I could spend more time than I have going through this, but I'm going to give you some high-level stuff. So we were working this as again, there was a project in here we had to move this API RBI, we had to move off of it, we had to move into, get RBI into APM. We're a 581, Meridium 581 customer, so we moved them over. That was a project in itself, converting the data, getting it in. At the time, we were looking at removing customizations, and we were working with the GE product team at the time to begin looking at key enhancements, and the slide is correct. It was GE at the time. It was not GE Vernova then, and as Vipin knows, yes, a lot of time with Vipin and others here to look at the thickness monitoring, look at cloud migration, what that meant. We began removing custom code because we knew that was a requirement to get us there. And as we worked through this slide, there were upgrades in here with V4 upgrades, other things where we slowly were pulling things out of the app, beginning to use more as we could, and get us to a point where we would be cloud ready. And somewhere along this line, we shifted to the private cloud. We pushed that it was no longer on-premise, and although it was still an on-premise application, it resided in the AWS cloud at that point, which was the private cloud. So we pushed that up to the virtual servers, and we had those upgrades over time, beginning to roll things out, improve our usage of it, and then, as they say in the movies, a few years later, and we're on this point of V5 here. And so that is what we did it was not just, we still had, we were using V4 here, we're looking at the V5 upgrade, and we didn't let's just upgrade V4. We chose a path of migration. Let's migrate V4, the data that was there, into the V5 instance. And the reason we did that was to come clean. You couldn't bring anything with you when you're only moving the data. And so through doing that, we were able to move the data over. And again, this is in the private cloud, but getting it into the cloud, it was still an on-prem application. But at that point, we were using just policies and field behaviors, and we had no more custom code because we didn't. I mean, we didn't move anything. So we were in a new, a clean V5 database with just the configuration we added. And so worked through that project, and everything there are always opportunities. And there were some setbacks that we ran into. We came up on V5. Our intent was, again, we were removing this largest layer of the yarn here. And our intent was to take it up on V5, run it several months on V5, and then go to the cloud. So we had a cloud-ready V5 instance that we could then move with GE Vernova into the GE cloud. Well, to be transparent, we had a few things that set us back about 6 months there. And we had some TM logic issues we had to deal with. We had some memory leaks on the application. We had some data loader failures and a couple of other things that really just slowed us down. So we had to work for that 6 months to kind of get us to a point where we could go. And that brings us to the cloud go live. So we're 6 months into this, and we're getting to a situation now where we're in the 2024, let's get the numbers right, 2024 timeframe now. And we had to immediately shift over to the GE, with GE and Vernova and the services group to get us to a point to come into the cloud as well. Whereas there were some other software issues we had with end of life within IT that were pushing us end of 2024, you've got to be off of the on-premise application. So we kind of were up against a wall at that point, but working with the GE Vernova team, we were able to take the database, take the system, and get us to a point where through that 8-month time period, and that's from start to finish, working with the services team, we were able to get there. And everybody in this room knows that bringing up an application in late November and early December is always a no-no. That's what you typically do not do. But that's where we were. We ended up with that go live in December of 2024, and I'm happy to say it went better than we thought it would. And really, it really wasn't, as it turned out, it was actually a blessing in disguise, because GE, the services team, told us, well, to take your database, the size of it, to get it pushed into the cloud, it's going to take us 2 weeks. They said, you'll be out without a system for 2 weeks. And we're like, yeah, that's not going to work. That's too long for the users to be out. So it actually worked out because they were able to shorten that time frame a bit. And then we were able to do it over the Thanksgiving holidays. For us, being a US-based customer, we don't have anybody anywhere outside of the US. Everybody's off during Thanksgiving. So for the most part, skeleton crews. So we were able to do that upgrade, get that pushed into the cloud over that Thanksgiving holiday. And so therefore it cut our 2 weeks of downtime down to really like 3 days of work time frame. And obviously anyone who was on site couldn't work and use it, but it wasn't a very big presence anyway. So it actually turned out to be a good thing for us from the standpoint of bringing it up. And then December, like I said, the first couple of days of December is when we brought it up. And again, there's always opportunities. And that's what we saw, some more opportunities. At this point, you know, our 3-day outage, we come up on December 2nd, and the yarn ball is gone at this point. We are completely moved to the cloud. Many years of getting us here, lots of working with GE, working with actually Meridium. We worked with GE, and then we worked with GE Vernova to get us here because of the years here. And so we saw some immediate performance issues. And you know, we had situations where this is the whole security timeout deal. We had a 10-day, 90-day, 10-day issues there. We had to get that worked out. People were getting logged out. We had some queries and Postgres database tuning that reduced some timeouts we had on some queries. And we had some other things that allowed for, you know, policy execution and everything. You said, well, why didn't you find that in your testing? Well, first of all, we did test. We had, again, a little bit of a shorter period of time than we would have liked to have had. But I'll be honest with you, we tested some of our largest TM circuits in pre-prod, and we didn't see some of the performance we saw when we went into production. Now, no one could explain that, but it was a reality. So my one word to you here today as you walk out of here is if you're moving to cloud, test, 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 test. You know, that's the best thing you can do to try to help your performance. But at the same time, you know, we had those issues. GE Vernova stepped up to the plate. They put a dedicated team on these issues and really worked with us to work through the timeouts. They tuned the database the best they could. They actually recreated a SSRS report that we have for corrosion monitoring. They quickly moved that over to AdViz, and we were able to produce the report that would not run in SSRS would execute in SSRS, in AdViz. And so we were able to do that. The deferred mode was a good thing for some of the big ones, and even some of the just running the report, we were able to actually get it to work in AdViz. So they built that report for us. It was one of the most complex reports we have. And really quickly, this took about 6 months. This was not an overnight deal here to get us to this point. So we ended up with, you know, being in sort of mid-2025 timeframe. And at this point, you know, we're 6 months later and we are up in the cloud, and you know, things are much better than what they were. But to give you just a quick summary of where we were before and after, and I'll talk more about it here in just a minute. Again, we were V3, we went to V4, V5, there were customized applications. We experienced performance issues on premise. We had some of the biggest instances that we could get in the cloud. We had some of the biggest servers we could have when they were physical. We still had performance issues, but we were able to, you know, make it work. This was a big item right here. It got to where upgrades. My manager, my supervisor, Mark Geisenhoff, is sitting here. We had to actually begin to justify some of the upgrades in these cases because, you know, the IT resources were doing other things. And so we had to manage and go through that. And so you know, that's where we were. And the current experience of where we are today is the positives. You know, this UI performance is faster, screen transitions, query results, policy execution. We were never, ever able to make it perform on premise like they can in the cloud. I don't know what happens behind the curtain, but it performs better in the cloud. Obviously, much lower IT burden on this, and the only thing we have to really do is test our integration. We have a custom integration, I'll mention in just a minute here, between our CMMS today and APM, and so we have to test that. But everything else, we just, get it to an opportunity in just a minute. Of course, this new release functionality is immediately available in the quarterly releases. But to the last one, you better be paying more attention to what's happening. You better be paying attention to what's happening, right, Vipin? What's happening under the cover? Yeah, because you don't get a choice. It just comes and it just shows up. So, but for us, that's working really well. And that leads us to a couple opportunities. We've seen that, we have to do a little bit more quarterly patching than we originally thought we would, but, we're getting through that. We've identified a couple things in non-prod they had to fix really quickly before they took it up to prod. The security model in cloud, much more complex than on-premise. This idea of the custom reports for AdViz, we've talked about that with LP, and being able to have the ability to generate complex reports in AdViz is a requirement. And I know they're working on that. And lastly, Postgres. We have seen performance issues with large data sets in Postgres. It is much better now after the patch that they released back in Q4 2025. But we did see where we would have timeouts with Postgres that we actually never had even in our SQL database. One other thing I should mention is, in this process and what we have today in the current experience, we actually licensed on the mobile. When we went to cloud, we licensed mobile. We could never, in our IT environment, we would have never been able to implement mobile. It just was not going to happen based on the way Flint Hills Resources is structured and the way we do software license. It was never going to happen. So that was one of our keys for moving to the cloud, was good ability to use the mobile. So we want to expand that. It is, I'll admit it, it's been difficult. I mean, it's one of those things where you're moving someone's cheese and they, you're making change, and so it has been a difficult thing, but we are going to get there. We're using more mobile to help our really for external visuals is really where we want to start. And then keys, the second bullet point is key to Vipin's presentation yesterday, talking about UT data collection within the mobile environment. We really are interested in that. Obviously, they're very soon will have the release for the manual entry, but we want the Bluetooth capability. Connected, we exclusively use the 39 DO pluses, and we want that Bluetooth capability that's coming with the new enhancement. We're participating with, I've got the name wrong, I admit that. At the time, it was Turnaround Assistant. When I created this presentation, it's now, what was it, Vipin? What was it?
It's Campaign.
Yeah, Campaign, yeah. So that's the new name, but we're participating in that beta program. Looking forward to that. Gen AI, what can Gen AI do for us? We believe there's lots of improvements, lots of just leaps and bounds of what it can do, and we're looking for the ability to handle the turnaround reporting and what we can do with large amounts of data coming in a short period of time. What's the easiest way to get it into the product? I have a homegrown system today that I use to convert these reports. It was not Gen AI because it was created years ago, but it's really brittle and I have to use it every day, every turnaround, but it's one of those things where we want to get to something that's productized and something that really works really well. So we're looking forward to this and the summarization stuff that you're going to have for summarizing across the events and things. That's also key to us, and believe that that will provide some additional insights. And then what's next? What's next with Gen AI, and what we're looking forward to that. That's again game changer for what we're seeing. And Flint Hills Resources as a company really we're embracing. We embrace the idea of using AI, and so it's a key focus area for us. And so we have completing the SSRS reported conversion. They've, again, converting to AdViz. That's another thing because, SSRS was going away, I think, Q3. So, getting those good results so far, although we had a couple things the last couple days with some timeouts, and we were going to work through that. And then we had some, this recent functionality here where we're looking at recommendation deferrals. We haven't completely implemented it at this point. We had a process in place prior to adding it to the software. So, again, you're going to be making a change. And then looking at this idea of linking tasks to TMLs, that's got to be done to get our ability to use the enhancements coming with mobile. And then bundle RBI rollout. We looked at a little bit of that initially, but that's where we want to go with RBI. And lastly, We are redoing our CMMS integration. I mentioned a few minutes ago, I'd tell you just a little bit about that. I'm getting close on time here. We have an API file-based integration that drops between CMMS and APM. We want to go to API, and the way I heard it is in the next next month or so, our IT group is actually probably going to have an API integration stood up that we can begin using between the product, and we can get rid of our file-based files being dropped. So, okay, great. Thank you again, everyone, for coming.